Here's a George one. Bring it, I'm not paying attention.
Hello everyone, thank you all so much for coming tonight. We're really excited about this lecture, especially since it's going to be tying into our May 2020 exhibit on decorative arts in Wythe County mainly, but so I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But upcoming exhibits, we have Fantasyland, which will open next Friday. Every Saturday in the month of December, there's going to be public days. So it should be really, really fun. We've added some new things for Fantasyland this year. So please come out, see what Santa's doing, see what we've got in the museum. It's going to be great fun. In January, we have a new exhibit. It opens January 23rd called Light and Shadow. It is a photography exhibit by a local hobbyist. He does miniature train, railroad model type scenes, and he photographs them, so it should be pretty fun and adventurous. They're very, very much like Winston Lake or Edward Hopper, so it'll be a pretty cool exhibit. That's January 23rd, and then again, May 2020, we don't have an opening date quite yet, but it is 250 years of Livestock County, so we're celebrating the anniversary of that, so it's Livestock County, 250 years of delight. So we are going to be having lots and lots of beautiful portraits, beautiful pieces of furniture, telling the story and the history of Livestock County. So please come out, stay tuned for that. I'm sure there's going to be lot more information about that soon. So I'm going to turn it back over to George. Thank you again for coming tonight.
Well, I always tell you about next month. Well, next month, in this case, is going to be February. We're going to take a break during the winter. So many things going on in December, and we don't know about the weather in January. So, in February, Professor Shannon Bell from Virginia Tech. She's the associate professor of anthropology. You happen to know her, Spencer?
Oh yeah. She's good people.
They've written a couple of books, and she's going to talk about the women's role in mountaintop removal, the coal mine in West Virginia and Western Virginia. That will be on the 4th Tuesday of February. You'll be notified about that. But you came to hear about material culture in Southwest Virginia, and here's a man who's going to tell us about it. Spenser Slough has quite an impressive background here. I'll just mention a few of the highlights. He's a graduate of William & Mary, also a graduate student at Virginia Tech. But he's done a good bit of research about the German culture in Southwest Virginia. He's been working with historical societies up there and a lot of research. Spencer?
Thank you. What am I supposed to do now? Yeah, that's not that joke. Well, we got to do an icebreaker. Thank you, George, very much for inviting me here, and for the Historical Society and for the museum. I'm very humbled to be here especially because I've been harangued to come to this part of Virginia for a long time. And once you hear my own personal narrative, I deserve a lot of backlash and why I haven't been here earlier. Because when I actually did come to, well, this is actually a more personal story because, credentials and CV, resume, and so forth. I'll tell you a story of a young man, happens to be named Spenser as well. 2012 comes to Blacksburg, Virginia, graduating from William Mary in early American history from William Mary with his then girlfriend but now wife, as she was beginning her PhD in clinical psychology at Virginia Tech. I did not get into my master's degree program at Tech, had to work my way in because of ADHD and other limitations. I was more intoxicated and more infatuated with this idea because of all the things that I learned at William Mary. Early American history, culture, interdisciplinary studies. And I knew so much about Piedmont, Virginia, Tidewater area, Chesapeake, and Virginia combined. Why didn't anybody ever put in consideration this other tier, region and people, what we would call the Southern Backcountry? So that young man came to a certain museum, I won't say it loud, for respect, and they said to me, you're not going to find much out here when it comes to that region in that time period before the Civil War. It was a bit disheartening, especially for somebody who at this time did not get into their graduate program. And yet, lo and behold, because this is material culture and because I love stuff, the one things that did keep me strong and kept me positive were these old periodicals. The Journal of the Roanoke Historical Society in 1980. 1970, James McDowell Travels in 1782. I got back to the roots and looking at the most local features of our history as humanity actually tells us a lot more about who we are, who we want to be, and who we can be. I did eventually go into the MA program in history at Virginia Tech, then went on to my second master's degree in material culture and public humanities, career graduate student, because he didn't want to enter the employment sector, admittedly. I'm not ashamed to say. But now, of course, why not? I'm just going to get a PhD. I am now getting my PhD in Appalachian Studies and History at Virginia Tech, more of an interdisciplinary degree. But I've always been more infatuated with stuff. Stuff. Why is this important? I dare anybody in this room tonight to look around, ask each other, why is this important? And why should we dare care to preserve, document, and then teach history, cultural history specifically, through this? It's been repaired. Yes, I did get it in an antique shop. Why should we care about that? It's really tough to actually define why this stuff, or what I would call tonight, material culture, the physical manifestations of cultural history, whether it's through the landscape, the buildings, the objects, artifacts, archaeological remains of our past time. Why should we care about this? In my argument today, well, hopefully this is more of a consensus in my testimony. Can't believe I said testimony. I've been watching too much of the impeachment trials today. Background noise, right? This is probably the best consensus I can ever bring about when talking about our stuff, is that objects, to quote John Stiles at the University of Hertfordshire, enable the social world to happen, and we need to take much more attention to what objects do and how they work. This is a front panel from a blanket chest from what is now today Smith County, Virginia. Actually was descended through the Spenser family that was very much a part of another conversation we'll have here in a second, though. so I won't spoil that. But objects enable the social war to happen. I have a lot of experience, especially when working with what is called the public humanities sphere, whether it be museums, oral histories, genealogy, historic preservation. And what's more important to me than anything is actually finding those people that are dedicated to documenting something that is important to them without reservation about what it means or what it could potentially mean, because over time. Because this can always be reinterpreted as something other than itself. And that's really hard. Because as a historian, I'm just trying to necessarily put it within contextual understanding. But what is really important at the end of the day is that it survives, whether it be through the four-dimensional form or two-dimensional, just through taking photographs, which a lot of times, unfortunately, that be the case, whether I go through houses, taking oral documentation of people, photographing pieces that are about to be demolished, whether it be house or physical form like this. That is what really matters to me. And this is what always was on my mind when I came to this region. And I was very, very fortunate enough to meet not only Roddy Moore at Durham College, but also then direct me to the right people. People with good heart at Wythe County, especially, like Michael Gilman, Jim Spraker, Francis Emerson, and of course, Mr. George Kegley. Via Nan, I would say. Her very, very sweet, his very, very sweet daughter-in-law. Some of the questions that we're going to actually be exploring tonight are sounding a little bit complex, but they're actually not when we actually tackle what some of the things that we're going to be looking at on the physical form. I apologize if I keep doing this because I am infamous, and my students will say this. I get dry mouth very easily. Go Tribe, 2012. Graduated from William & Mary with a maroon and burnt orange heart. That's right. If we are exploring tonight the craftsmen, the material culture, and the legacies of Southwest Virginia, it provokes a lot of really poignant questions and inquiries, especially into the daily life of early settlements that go particularly, and this is my cap-in tonight, just before the Civil War. As one historian once said, that craftsmen were charged with upholding standards of artificiality and utility, meaning that especially that if they were able to make aesthetic emblems of status, simultaneously they were supposed to be utilitarian, that you could use them still in daily life. So if we are going to look at backcountry craftsmen and women that produce materials, it actually provides a lesson, not only in just the dynamic change in the regional outlook, but also dramatizes the effect of culture, particularly those of these more complex cultures that were not originally seen on the East Coast, Piedmont regions of the then early developing United States of America. So let's begin. America's first frontier sits just east of the Appalachian Mountains. Its southern half is what I would call, and I've already referred to as the southern backcountry of the United States of America. Characterized by mountainous ridges, burning bottomlands, misty swamps, and rushing rivers, it stands as a region of rich cultural and geographical contrasts. Beginning in the 1720s, large numbers of land-seeking immigrants, predominantly from Pennsylvania, previously from Europe in some cases, ventured down the Great Wagon Road into the southern backcountry. Some of the most earliest European settlers came from western Maryland and the northern Valley of Virginia. Soon, New land opened into the southern and western valleys and upper regions of the Carolinas. Market towns grew, traded with one another, and with the larger global cities that then serviced larger rural populations. It is a very complex mix. These Germans, Swiss, French, English, Irish, Welsh, Ulster Scottish, African settlers arrived in waves, resulting in a polyglot landscape of high levels of cultural interplay. Just looking at this 1770 map by John Henry of a new and improved map of Virginia wherein most counties are laid, you can actually see this is what, at least on a cartographical scale, of how the English Empire is trying to demarcate their boundaries. And this is the same type of topography that is still being talked about in the past, present, and future tense to this day. And if you actually look, we can actually look at some of these features that are being defined here that are actually not too far off, and he actually did a pretty good job for 1770 cartography. There actually were a pretty good amount of settlements here in the 1770s, but they retreated at one point, because that's Southwest Virginia as we know today. But we'll get to that here in a second, though. And that brings me to my point about the Great Wagon Road in general. Near the end of the American Revolution, we are looking at primarily second-generation families, communities, church congregations en masse, predominantly again from southeast Pennsylvania, western Maryland, northern Virginia, or Piedmont, North Carolina, began concentrating what was then part of the western half of Augusta, Fincastle, then very quickly called Montgomery County, Virginia. And then, of course, it split off into multiple different counties thereafter. The roles and resources, however, of the artisans that were a part of this new community settlements are outstanding. They provided these transplanted communities numerous opportunities, and they were culturally influenced by their old and new world heritages and experiences. But it's important always to think about context, and this is what I always tell my students at Virginia Tech. Context is key, and it doesn't necessarily just put in context of who's talking, who is delivering the perspective, but where they are coming from. This is actually a very rare photo just before the creation of Claytor Lake in just outside Montgomery County, in what's today Pulaski County, of what was called Dunker's Bottom. One of the earliest settlements. Do you have a question?
That's Church of the Brethren. I'm Church of the Brethren, and that's us, Dunkers.
Anabaptists.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. 1745, earliest one. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the earliest European settlements in this region. For the ones that actually, with the scant amount of documentary evidence or even material evidence that we have, actually the Dunkers were actually very harmonious when it came to cohabitation with American Indian tribes. Dunkers were very much what we consider more communal, very much down-to-earth peoples, and kind of given a bad rap, especially from people like Alexander Spotswood, William Byrd III, who would characterize these people as going into the river with no shoes on and no socks on, and praying for a God that's other than the Anglican Church, heaven forbid. But the revolution had not happened at that point, so oh well. That would not be the first or the last time that an itinerant preacher went through Southwest Virginia and talked badly about somebody that did not preach the same way as they did. But you can actually see a very good timestamp here. This is the bottomland. The New River Valley, New River specifically, this is 1930, in the middle of the Depression. Still pretty reliable on basic geography here. When you look at things like this, you can honestly understand where people are coming from, especially with not necessarily that they're isolated or geographically contained. But this is the best that they can do with the landscape that was dealt to them by the cosmos. It is an area that is mountainous, watershed littered with several branches and creeks, lying along bottoms. Well-watered, pretty comparatively flat lands below a mountain ridge. Mountain ridge on the top here, ideal places of settlement for oncoming migrants. What a right way for people from Northern Ireland, Scotland, Ireland, Palatinate Germans to come in and seek and grab land. Sometimes in upwards of 50 to 60 people. For those settlers that did traverse the Great Road, and I'm going to go back here because I do have one distinction, and this is not a slight against my good friends at the Wilderness Road Regional Museum, because I love them to death. When talking about the geography and at least the transportation routes, we're very much looking at licks, salt licks specifically. There's a reason why a lot of these areas for the original times are called licks, or Big Lick, or this place that we so happen to be in today, or Kirchensburg, which once was called Hans Meadow, or Blacksburg. When we were looking at the geography of the terrain here, and I added this through Photoshop just to illustrate, even my Photoshop capabilities actually demonstrated easy recognizable, capabilities with this Google Earth photo. These are pronounced areas of transportation that were beyond those own people's abilities. These were the best available opportunities. And when it did come time to actually go through what is today Roanoke, it split down either one way, Carolina Road, and then the other way actually came through here, the Great Road, that would actually go into greater Southwest Virginia or into Northeast Tennessee. When it actually did come to places like Martin Station, the Wilderness Road began. Just a clarification there. I'm always happy to debate them, and I lovingly accept and offer their interpretation. No animosity there at all, I promise. But for those settlers that were traveling this great road, Southwest Virginia, Northeast Tennessee specifically, those that were sailing into Southwest Virginia specifically before 1790, oftentimes they brought only the bare necessities. Some exceptions, however. And we know this specifically through what are called probate inventories. Probate inventories are a lot of fun. Not really. They're really cool to look at, but they're very arduous to actually obtain and actually look at on microfilm. Essentially, these are inventoried valuations of one person's material wealth. Not capital wealth, but material wealth. Meaning that there are people from the county court that are administered and given an oath to go to one's estate after they are deceased and actually inventory and then evaluate what specific material wealth this one person had. And then subsequently, if there were any things that they had in debt to one another person, then they would charge that against them. So whoever was their executor, then they would go after them. And we know specifically in the early years between 1770 and 1790 that there are some overlapping commonalities, especially between the New River, Roanoke River, and the Holston River Valley communities. Livestock, horses, pigs, sheep, cattle, 92% of their estates. 10% of their estates indicated that still, however, they brought along necessary tools or agricultural materials, not only just to construct permanent structures, but also to get by during unforeseen weather circumstances. The most commonly owned tool above all is the axe. It's the only tool that you need to build a log cabin. And it is understandable considering it is the sole tool that would also build a log cabin, but it also can give you pretty much immediate defense if you don't have a rifle. This is the Rutledge log house, Thomas Rutledge log house specifically, that I documented in 2014, that I've revisited multiple times since then. And it's a beautiful place with a very nice family, and it's a beautiful construction that is remarkably still intact to this day. And one of the things that we can always remember is that architecturally, it's very emblematic of what is going on during this time period, because it has everything to tell us as a social history of how people are building the bare necessities that then you can expand and then make into a permanent structure. If you notice particularly here, there is a separation up and down, and then if you actually cut right here, there is a cut right between these two structures on the right versus the left. This is what architectural historians will call ghost prints. It is a stamp upon construction history. Easily enough, you can actually interpret that this was the original log cabin right here. The chimney actually stopped right here, and then was expanded further upward once this addition was added to the right, add more heat and hearth to the family room. Furthermore, in probably about 1840s, 1850s, second level was added. Because they already had split the foundation right here, they had a second floor and split it already in. If there's ever one rule for preservation of log cabins, the first thing that's going to go is the roof. If you don't protect your roof, it's going to cave in and destroy everything, especially because these are actually very skinny logs. And what's really interesting, especially here, is that this is a cultural timestamp for the Ulster Scot Irish tradition. If we look back to early on Irish, specifically Western Irish tradition, archaeologists know this through years and years of research, that this is something that was almost fastidiously and impeccably implemented, was this architectural plan called low, white, and thatched plans. In Irish culture, it's very much predominant that you have a low, long, white, and thatched house. Very much based upon the cattle industry. And in doing so, this is an Ulster Irish family, the Rutledges, at this time, very, very early, second generation Irish family. You always have two rooms, one big room and one little room. Your big room is where you have your domestic space. Your little room is where your cattle go in and out. There's one door that is parallel to the other, and lo and behold, if you look just right in front here, where my little pointer is, it's this front door. Straight on parallel to the next one. Now, there's no way in God's green earth that there isn't cattle going through here. But this is an adaptation and diversification of what you've been taught to build things in the right way. This is a cultural memory and interplay. And if you actually look at some of the other things that they actually do, if you look at this side of the chimney right here, it's a heart. Actually, if you look on both sides of the chimney, and I'm sorry because I wanted to save space on here. That is a heart and what are called, at least to oral memory, these are portholes, supposedly to deter any Indian uprisings in nearby Catawba Valley. It's a lot of social history involved just in one little place. But as I mentioned, the earliest waves of Europeans necessitated the bringing of builders, because you have to build stuff in order to build communities. House rights, wain rights, I'm going to say a lot of rights here. Mill rights, wheel rights, Allen blacksmiths. If it's not a right or a smith, you're probably in the right direction. These craftsmen could not only build barns, houses, wagons, farming tools, and structures, but were also able to quickly repair them. We take for granted the people that were actually able to build stuff versus those that were able to build them. I worked for County of Williamsburg at the age of 12, and I was harangued for calling a shoemaker a cobbler, because the shoemaker makes shoes, a cobbler repairs them. But this is a good pointing case of the significance of those that were actually able to repair stuff. Families and communities would typically arrive mid to late period of winter to see their farms by January or February. And in doing so, that ensured by June they would have a self-sufficient amount of crops. They could actually harvest particularly by the spring season. Such timeliness necessitated that these people would be accompanied by skilled persons who could quickly raise structures, construct tools, all needed for survival. For 1 to 2 months, families would most likely live in literally shacks, or what are called half camps. Open-faced log structures that would be about like that, almost like an acute angle. It's the only part of math class that I was good at, was geometry. Open-faced log shelters lashed together typically with vines or rawhides. When it came to actually building farm structures, lo and behold, Germans, unlike their Ulster Scot or English counterparts, felt more compelled to build enormous, extravagant, 2-floor barn structures, provide storage and wooden threshing floors for the processing of crops, also known for stables for their livestock. Think about that. For a typical family, as I said, 92% of your inventory is your livestock. Housing that many livestock into one building, you have to do it. You have to pull your weight to actually build a structure that size. But in Pennsylvania, this was actually pretty much the norm as documented. And it was very well known for building what are called 4-bay log structures, also known as what we call today the Pennsylvania barn or cantilever barn. And if we look at, this is where my bias comes in, Smith and Wythe County, the largest concentration of German descendants settled, builders stuck to this prototype to a T. Actually, in some cases, altering and expanding that form. As you can see, in some cases, we'll go back to this one. Typically, when we're looking at cantilever barns, overhanging structures that are housing not just your grain supplies. Your first floor would be called your thrashing, thresh upon the threshold, that's where the term comes from. You're threshing your flax, and etc. It has 3 floors. I've yet to see an example in American history, other than 5, that there has ever been a cantilever barn at this period of time that has 3 floors. It's pretty unique, at least in this case. And it's not actually extant anymore, unfortunately. What the 3rd floor was used for is up to your imagination, but it's pretty significant in itself. But even for non-German family members, you can actually look and see that they were still contracting German craftsmen to do good, honest work. This is in Back Creek, which is just a little bit past what is today Dublin, Virginia, in Pulaski County. And beautiful craftsmanship that is still to this day standing, I believe, that is still very much embodying what is seen from Pennsylvania, but originally from Europe. But even the most utilitarian things, settlers found a way to inscribe culture onto their agricultural world. A hackling or flax comb, a commonplace object on any farm. It's not really hard to make clothes in this day. I mean, a couple years of development, matured flax stalks, production of linen cloth. Man, it's no big deal. All you would have to do is once stalks were harvested, you would have to, 1, pull, spread, soak water, sun dry, pound, pull, and then place on a table with bolts on each side and thrash it. No big deal, right? This little hackling comb, and I apologize because the light's a little bit too dim on it, there are actually zigzag lines on the top here, and these are just essentially blacksmith-made rudimentary nails. But even in the most utilitarian things like this that you use on a utilitarian purpose, you can still decorate and make beautiful. Like geometrical designs like this that would eventually just be bolted down onto a table and then pulling flax through and out. You still want to have a cultural imprint, which is a message not just for those in the future, but a staple reminder for those in the present of where they come from and also what is the right way to do things. This is a comb from the Vogelson family of rural retreat, and it demonstrates an intergenerational extension, specifically from Pennsylvania to Virginia, and it is something that you should go and see. I donated it to Wythe County, Virginia 2 years ago. Wythe, Virginia, go see it. But here's a new one that I dare that many of you all have not seen before, because this is actually a result of just 2 months ago efforts by documentation by the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. This is not the only one that has ever been documented. Actually, there were about a dozen Zachariah Robinson walking canes. And again, even the most mundane, handmade luxuries speak to us in the most intricate ways. Zachariah was born in Shenandoah County, Virginia, to Thomas and Sarah Robinson. 1830, Zachariah would marry Hannah Stover, and they settled in what is today present-day Roanoke, Virginia. By 1837, he would build a large 12-room brick home, which also operated as a tavern. He's a hopeless, meticulous craftsman in his own right, who is using much more of the Irish tradition of utilizing not just the more mundane world of the Presbyterian understanding of Calvinists and mixed with Presbyterian understandings of community and frugality, but also that of which some would say this is a dog and this is a bird. It's always debatable when this was documented just 2 months ago, so this is a rare showing. But then, of course, just imagine in 1833 making this cane and then carving all of this by hand. Zachariah Robinson, his staff, made in the year of our Lord, 1838. I said 1833, I apologize. My name will have perhaps whom in my grace this walk when you may see. That was all carved by me. You can be very poetic when you're building material emblems like itself. Not just showing pride for what you can do, but also pride, hopefully, your peers will give to you. That rhymed as well. But of course, pioneers also arrived with pre-established connections, especially to those eastern markets. Transatlantic empire goods specifically, and those previously obtained luxury items, violins, swords, books, pocket watches, they appear readily, especially in these early estate probate inventories, and they attest to their being there along with early settlers. This circa 1760 imported China, sorry, big fingers, big little thing, gravy dish was actually brought by the Kent family, originally from Bedford County to Montgomery County, Virginia. Probably made in between 1750 to 1760. Where it is located is unknown, and it frustrates the heck out of me because I'd love to see it in person. It is a beautiful, beautiful representation of the British Empire at this time. It is but one example of the many connections to the Atlantic world of consumerism and commerce. And having that knowledge means a lot, especially when we talk about early commerce and connectivity to the greater world of goods. As over time, roads, ferries, and ordinaries, or taverns, facilitated more local to regional, national market connections. Residents quickly acquired goods from other means after their arrival. As the population became much more dense, taverns increased their role to greater connections, not just in harvesting those that were ample and ready for a drink, laying down, staying the night, as required by law, because if they were too drunk, they'd have to stay at a tavern. That is literally the law at this time. But also they operated in some cases as stores. And if you had one merchant connection in at least Britain or Scotland, two other great merchant connections at this time, then you could get anything you want and deliver to anybody across the world. As early as the 1760s, for example, in what is today called Dublin, or then called New Dublin, we have luxury breakables like 12 different types of Delftware, Queen's China, beginning to appear into ledger accounts, alongside silver pieces and other luxury goods. If you have a merchant or a rudimentary store, even before the American Revolution, you could buy anything that you want if you had the means to do so. Also the knowledge to know what you want. But rural stores were the most common domestic, non-domestic building on the landscape, supplying early families with common necessities and amenities. The wealthiest would actually utilize a consignment of marketing where they sold their own crops to agents across the East Coast, fulfilled them, across to merchants once more. Originally required to produce objects and structures, however, craftsmen at this time were also requested to maintain culturally based applied aesthetic construction techniques. This is an entry from this site. Once again, if you haven't seen it, please do. Very nice people, the Ingalls family. The very nice lady who owns it is the 6th generation, Mary Drapel Ingalls VI, who actually owns it to this day with her husband. It has easement from the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, and it's beautiful. The only thing that did not survive past this historic period was there's an extension on the left. And Lewis Miller actually drew a sketch of this entire landscape. You can just barely see the New River is right there. That was a tavern and a store, all in one spot. All you would have to do is just park your wagon just about half a mile down the road. All you have to do is just keep going. You go down what is today Route 11. Even in their own leisure, however, you can actually see this connection to the greater neighborhood. John Crockett debited to the amount of goods served to Clinch River Valley. Amount of earthenware. They got a good showing of earthenware here. Once more, we actually see some tangible representations of, even though that these are the most utilitarian ways in which people are using the original Pyrex and, can't believe I'm drawing a blank here, Tupperware, there it is. This is what you got. The majority of the things that you actually are seeing here, especially 1, 2, and then 3, are actually about this big. But they're remarkably beautiful, and they are a direct cause of the geography dealt to these people that work the land. If you ever dug at least half an inch into Southwest Virginia soil, what type of clay do you get? Oh, it's bright red, and it's frustratingly bright red and thick, especially when there's a lot of rain and a lot of snow. But it gives us a good soil to make earthenware, or redware in some cases. But this is typical. You can go to any part of rural America up until the 1920s, and this was still being made left and right. Sometimes with lead glazing and sometimes with a lot more oxidized glazing. It doesn't mean, however, that these people are not discounting the ability to make things beautiful. Take, for instance, this more grandiose jug here. It's owned by my good friend Roddy Moore. With, it's hard to see right here, but you have one heart that is now inversed over here that's from Rural Retreat, Virginia. This is called a buggy jug that has its handle broken off. And it's called a buggy jug because it's a lot more centered on the bottom, a lot more heavier, so it's not going to fall off your buggy. Yes, typically to hold whiskey. But then you can go to your more rudimentary containers like this crock over here, and you can just barely see right here, that's a 2. It's somebody literally just with a nail inscribed 2, and you can hold up to 2 gallons. Perhaps no other ethnic demonstrated and permeated the effect of cultural memory than Germans. Shocker, right? These Germans who would call Southwest Virginia their home were people who originated from diverse areas of Europe, particularly at this time, what was the remnants of the Holy Roman Empire. If you actually were to look at it, and when I did a talk for the Gross Close Family Reunion in Pipestem, West Virginia in 2018, there's one great map in 1720. Literally, you had about 160 individual, I guess what we would call counties in the more contemporary sense. But it wasn't even a real conglomerated nation at this point. Germany, as we know it today, really wasn't even Germany until just before World War I. These are little protectorates that were all individually speaking several different languages across what we consider France, parts of Belgium, even Italian mix, very much still hanging onto the feudal realm that they knew. But at this time period, especially in the early 1700s, there is a massive immigration with an E, meaning that these were forced people coming away, especially because of religious persecution, particularly those that were associated with the Lutheran or Lutheran Reformed faith. When they do come to America, they do state a more folk form that is much more composed of the Rhenish and Swiss elements. It usually goes back to about the 14th century. German families quickly begin to create their own hybrid forms, and they continually reinterpret these traditional motifs, especially when it comes to being lively, in your face, oversized, and punctuating religious piety. It's always the face, and hopelessly moralistic in everything that they make and show to you. That is the German vocabulary when it comes to crafts. And when it comes to at least local vocabulary, we're talking about geometric shapes, horses, riders, turkeys, tulips, urns, birds, Gothic lettering, flowers. Everything that you could possibly associate within the Bible that is going to be emblematic into material cultural manifestations. Morality and piety, stressing the importance of faith, education. Early German communities grew around these congregations. As I said, literally, people, if they came across as family communities, that they knew each other from previous communities in the north, if they were the Lutheran or Lutheran Reformed, sometimes called the Swiss Reformed communities, they would come in congregations, and they would create new congregations when they came to Southwest Virginia. This is from Klaus Woest's work in folk art and stone, and literally circling these major conglomerates, especially into the deeper part of Southwest Virginia. North Fork of the Holston it would become Sharon in 1817, that's right up there. Elk Creek would be obsolete by, I believe, the latter part of 1809, I believe, because it just, once major Great Road routes were connected, it was kind of remiss to create Elk Creek is down here in Grayson. It was just more remiss to keep a congregation there. Because at this point, it's not a coincidence that they're all following this one line, north and south. They're following geography, but they're all following the same congregational, alignments of peoples. But they exhibited some of the most beautiful material culture. They perpetuated to recognize, celebrate, remember life's most memorable events. There are about over 30 examples of these things that you see before you. Specifically, it's a form of fracture, which by definition is a broken lettering form of calligraphy that goes back to really the 12th century in Middle Europe. Specifically, this is called Taufschein, which literally, if you break apart Tauf and then Schein, it's birth and baptism. So it's a birth and baptismal certificate. Before there was ever a requirement by the federal government to have a birth certificate, this is what you have. This is the earliest form of an American birth certificate, specifically for German immigrants just before and a little bit after the American Revolution. 1780 on the left, sorry, it is the typo, and then about 1820 on the right. Typical features: colorful, handwritten, graphic alphabets, calligraphic text, abstract borders, watercolor tones. I actually found one that was stuffed into a collection of papers of about 800 manuscript items from a non-German family, the Sextons of Wythe County, at the Library of Virginia, and it was literally falling apart, and I thought I was going to cry. Like, these are things that are sold on antique online for upwards of $20,000, and they're only about this big. These are beautiful forms that not only cherish the remembrance of who they are, but when people do leave their German communities, this is at least the cultural imprint that once you do leave, this is almost a sign and token that once you do go to a new congregation, wherever it be in the United States, this is a sign that you've been baptized and you've been confirmed by your Lutheran congregation, and here is your certificate to do so, or to approve. Specifically with this formation is what's called the wild turkey artist in Wythe County, and so called by these much more turkey-esh formation, simply because of at least the gander from the mouth. You can just barely see just below the beak here. They're not like parrots, which you would typically see in places like Shenandoah County, Botetourt County. Whether you want to call that a turkey or a peacock, which is very much within line with biblical elements. What we do see is a lot of use of really Gothic medieval things like Maltese crosses and large tulips sprouting from more Baroque, almost grotesque urns. Stars, hearts, symbolizing Christ and his embodiment of the earth. Every piece written in what's called Kernscript, or German script, something that only a dozen of people to this day, still know how to translate. And they are always typically written by school teachers within those congregations because they are always predicated on teaching the young within the right ways to doing things. Even within the early books by St. John's Lutheran Church in Wythe, Virginia, you can actually see that there are the first orders in forming their congregation is to teach every student basic alphabet and mathematics. Teachers in the school were always ordered to be a part of teaching the basics of what we would call arithmetic and Roman learning or classical learning, Greek, philosophy, Latin, and so forth. But of course, there's a little bit more recognizable stuff, the big boy stuff, right? Painted blanket chests, some of the most highly valuable pieces to this day, what we would typically call dower chests, or those that are called Ausschanktisch, or made for either young German girls or given to couples as a wedding gift, typically. This is much more into the traditional Pennsylvania German tradition. Once we are reaching into the latter part of the American Revolution, post-American Revolution, it's much more a staple to have because it's very convenient to use as a storage space, especially when you start hybridizing and using it as a chest on drawers. But they're still very, very aesthetic when we look at some of their decorative techniques. It's a decorative aesthetic that's mirroring Germanic use of polychrome paint, literally using a sponge, tapping and painting excruciatingly on every point to mirror almost in a three-dimensional level every time you look at it. All the chests that we see here, which are part of this Wythe County School of blanket chests, are either consisting of 2 or 3 astragal tombstone or rectangular shaped panels. And they always have some sort of combination of the urn, the tulip, which is surmounted by an arc or halo. Then we have accompaniments of petals, geometric diamonds again, remember the flax hackle. The craftsman wood of choice for every chest, just like a good old Virginian, always using poplar. It's cheap, it's affordable, it's pretty much everywhere you can find, and it's easy to actually apply those decorative aesthetics to it. But in other forms, we actually see things pretty much going hand in hand. Before I actually go to things like cupboards, however, I do want to highlight the Good History Museum of Western Virginia, especially literally highlighting some of the basic things that we have already seen. And again, I'm sorry that the light's a little bit dark. This is a little bit more of a hybrid here because this is kind of a sign of not just the changing in times and utility. Having chests of drawers is a much more English Chippendale tradition of this time period. Now, while Germans are very stubborn in necessarily acculturating their own values, we've seen, at least in the material tradition, that they're actually much more willing to accommodate the utility of adding drawers here at the bottom. So this is technically called a blanket chest of drawers, over drawers. And then when you release the top here, you can actually see still a meticulous detail in not necessarily the hinging, still use of poplar, exposing no material use of anything metal, just wood, dovetail to dovetail. And of course, it's not Germanic if you don't use a motif that is emblematic of your morality and piety, like the heart that is on the edge of the chest. I believe it's on the left side. This picture was taken. I'd like to see that one day.
It's on view. You can come see it anytime you want.
But in the forms, there are repeated instances, and you can really just see them. It just so happened that both of these are actually from Montgomery County, particularly in Christiansburg. And when the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts actually looked at them in, I believe it was 1976, by then the late and great Frank Horton, the founder of MESVA, looked at these and documented them, you see immediately some striking similarities here, especially of not only a appreciation for bracketed, more English feet, symmetric, neoclassical panes and windows. But then again, when you look down below, why the need to add much more straggled tombstone style paneling onto the bottoms of these drawers, however? What use other than to make a more playful statement of your craft tradition, to serve a family that is undoubtedly Scotch-Irish, the Craig family of Christiansburg, Virginia, who were actually the reason why Christiansburg, Virginia exists to this day, because the Craig family gave up the land lots to incorporate what is today Christiansburg. But then again, when we look at textiles, see a lot of similarities, because especially with Germans, when we mix in, especially the English-speaking Anglophone peoples, they brought with them more recent knowledge, especially those techniques to create what is called block pattern textiles, which eventually would make its way to the southern backcountry after the American Revolution. There are two styles typically pronounced, especially when we look at textiles, between about 1780 to 1850. Especially in Germanic origins, there are the Morning Star patterns and the Snowball patterns. The Morning Star produces quilts that are typical with what's called Leitenblick, or lighter block. And while the Snowball, or Schneibel, show more typical Scheibenblick, or dark, heavier block motifs. My German is awful, I apologize. I did Spanish for 4 years and Latin for 1 year, and see where I am today. But when we look at much more of a German plan, we are typically following more blue and white patterns. And this is one that was documented by the History Museum of Western Virginia, probably from Troutville in Wythe County. And it contrasts with much more of those red, blue, green, or light dark red traditions, especially from more of the Anglophone communities in the earlier period of settlements of those English speakers. Because especially when we look at those that are emblematic of what are called Turkish knot traditions. One bed rug that is owned by the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts that is attributed to either Roanoke or Wythe County actually is emblematic of it, and it's more knotted rather than pounded on a thresh and pulled back and forth more with these double knotted features that I was just talking about. But we all need to recognize, of course, our immortality. And there is something that is always great when looking at some of our own most emblematic designs in our finite existence. Probably one of my more memorable experiences was when I first was working on my first master's degree in 2014, was actually to go look at some of these graveyards. Along the hills, we can see not just Lutheran congregations or Lutheran Reformed congregations, but also a very particular plan. And just not only material lexicon, vocabulary that is being emblematically implemented, but also a statement on how people want to be remembered. Even up to the Civil War period, people are still speaking German. People are still making gravestones that are emblematic of how they want to be remembered. And these are just some of the cursory glances from 1770 just about to 1860. Over 160 gravestones to this day have been documented. They are quickly fading due to acid rain, and it's really painful to see them every single day when I go back and look at them. These were pictures that I took in 2015. This one right here actually is chipped away, and that tulip is actually gone. But it's really beautiful remembrances, and this is the importance of historic preservation and documentation of how people want to be remembered. Even the most bizarre one, and this is a quick little anecdote, Roddy Moore, of course, taught me how to look at folklore understandings of the material world, and he was once caught by a reporter and saying it almost looks something like an alien. And he was quoted saying this is a lollipop carver. I told this to the director of Nesbitt, and he was kind of laughing. He was like, that's what Roddy wrote about. And then next thing you know, Roddy gets a phone call from History Channel, be on Ancient Aliens. And he said, get the hell out of my house. Yeah, but no, this is actually the forgot what it's called, the biblical term, the rod of something, and rod of Jesse, excuse me. And again, you can just barely see it because it's tilting over. It's the backside of this one, which is actually a lot more of a grotesque resemblance of a tree of life. But that is the rod of Jesse actually springing forth new life. It's not alien. The message for that story is don't ever say alien, especially when reporters are taking your news. There's probably no other stonemason that is more recognizable than Lawrence Groen, who worked throughout Southwest Virginia. He's frustrating as heck to document, though. And the only thing that we have to document his work is with his extant products, and then documentation through the more trivial things like financial records. Crone was the epitome of what we would call an itinerant. Nebulous, frustrating, hard to pinpoint. He typified what is considered an itinerant lifestyle. Typically, we're working within a region for a given amount of time that is this short. Rather than in a specific locality, he obviously would go back and forth between 3, sometimes to 4 different counties in one particular month. In contracted work, however, we can actually look at documentation like this entry from Robert Sawyer's in 1811 to 1812, it looks like, or 1809 to 1812, and see that he was actually contracted for other things just other than just gravestones. And actually, this is pretty typical of this time period. You cannot make money just actually making gravestones, especially when you have a rich amount of local limestone in Southwest Virginia able to you. He was actually doing a lot of work. Actually, if you go just a little bit west of Wytheville, past St. John's Lutheran Church, you can actually find the repast stone house that he made, almost single-handedly. He actually did the enclosure for the Cloyd graveyard in Back Creek in Pulaski County as well. But he also did the work for Robert Sawyer's for example, making a stone hedge. He would also make a stone piazza. He misspelled it. It's piazza. A very, very intricate design feature in 1810. This is supposed to be Southern Backcountry where you're not supposed to know this type of knowledge. This is a very refined way of building things. And yet this itinerant, he was literally going back and forth. He's from Berks County, Pennsylvania, knew how to make these types of architectural implements for somebody. But as we begin in Roanoke County, we see some very intricate things coming from him. Old tombstone, maybe erected in 1805, 1806. Commemorates the death of a 9-year-old Robert Denton, and legend, as we know it, says that Crone arrives to Southwest Virginia from Berks County, Pennsylvania, gets sick. The Denton family in Roanoke, which they Salem, houses him for a brief time, a couple of weeks, and to repay their hospitality, he makes this monument to the tribute of their recently deceased son. You should not find this kind of stuff in Southwest Virginia. It is a beautiful, hopelessly in-your-face expression of material culture that is written in 3 different languages as hearts, tulips, sentimental poems in German, German script, Latin, and English. has a corpse. Once upon a time, it did have a cover that was vandalized and taken off the top. But it's unique in a Virginia contest because it's emblematic of the vitality and more of an eclectic quality of this person, who, again, should not have such a sophistication and knowledge to build such a thing. Decorative motifs, we've always talked about them thus far. Hearts, tulips, the rising sun, life after death, biblical motifs, right? Generously providing products of the greater lettering, which Crone is known for, and we'll see here in a second, and a willingness to carve the German Gothic script. All things that we should not be able to see, because these are people that are isolated. They're remote. They don't have a greater connection to the world. Let's return to Wythe.
Was that in East Hill Cemetery in Salem?
Yeah, and it has a cage, kind of a cage barricade on it. Mm-hmm. And that's why they have the cage on it, because it has a history of dereliction and mistreatment, because you can literally see the evidence of where it was chipped off here. Rumors were, at least the oral tradition, it actually had a silver inlay on top of it that was built with a crux, I think right here. You could actually lift it up and down, but you can definitely see there was a top for it. It's pretty intricate, and I think it was estimated, at least when the Virginia Department of Historic Resources actually took a picture of it and documented it in as recent as 2010, according to Mike Pulis. I think they said it would probably estimate weigh over 2 tons. Granted, they put cement blocking on the bottom of it, though, so nobody could, ruin it. That's not his body in there, though. And that's not this person's body either in here, that I always have to tell people, especially when I'm volunteering to do talks in Wytheville. Because this is probably the most second well-known work by Lawrence Crone, commemorating the life of one Reverend Father George Daniel Floor. One of the most memorable creations for Father Floor in the St. John's Cemetery Lutheran congregation. It's much more centered, formalized, utilizing rosettes, most often appearing on headstones, always within a German fashion. You've got to have a headstone and then a footstone, so you always know which way you're facing, heaven and earth, or heaven and hell, north and south orientation. That's why if you ever look at original floor plans for cities before the American Revolution, look at your church, look where it's centered in the rest of the urban center, you always know where north and south is. It's much more centered and formalized than what we would see on much more headstones, symbolizing the eternity of the soul. Crone's roses are actually a lot more recalling of what is called more of the Rosicarian or Tudor allegories at this time. Really old school, and what we would consider what is a rose at this time. You can look back into the 14th century and look at some of these early calligraphy drawings. But these are very typical features that we would find with Crone's work that are high, rounded shoulders, 3/4 round elements of limestone, front edge, and they're serrated, and they have this crusting that he does all around the side. Now, you have to understand, he did not do this just with a chisel. He has molds. This is an on-site work. As I said earlier, that he was doing masonry for a lot of other people across the area. But he is a genius when it comes to building molds that are so detailed and intricate to a T. But then we go to one family cemetery that is not German. Actually, it's Scots-Irish. It's the McGavicks, Fort Chiswell. Because despite these cultural and linguistic differences, ethnic groups actually did transcend cultural boundaries. And within Fort Chiswell, which is the eastern side of Wythe County today, is the mansion cemetery of the well-known Ulster Scott family, the McGavicks. These look very Germanic for an Ulster Scott family. And if you actually look at Smithfield Plantation in Blacksburg, if you look at the comparison with, say, one William Preston, you would not find something like this, who is arguably his counterpoint, James McGavick Sr. versus William Preston, pioneers during the American Revolution who's fighting essentially those that are still faithful to the British Crown. William Preston was able to import his own gravestone slabs from Philadelphia, slapped down on the ground, very much in the style of Tidewater, Virginia Great Elites. If you go to Westover Plantation, you saw the Birds, the Carters, etc., James River plantations, that's what you would find. You would not find this, a specific German cultural plant of a material cultural lexicon on an Ulster Scott track. And yet this is honoring local deference at its highest mark. More refined, however, in this example, are architectural features that we don't see before. It's almost like it's a Romantic and Greco formulation of towers, pillars, arcs, keystones, flanking columns. He's doing something here that is actually harking back to something that is more in style here. Well, James McGavick Jr., Sr., I should say, would die in the early 1800s. A lot of other people would have their bodies buried in this cemetery. The Cloyds, the Kents, etc. A lot of well-known people from Pulaski, Wythe, Montgomery, even into the Roanoke River Valley. But they still speak to the folk elements that German craftsmen are utilizing here. They're not taking away their own features. They're still using hearts, roses, tulips, and urns, but they're accommodating for the wishes of their patron, even using wheat for the very first time and only known case in this one cemetery. Which brings us to the major catalyst in the latter half, or I said the last quarter of this lecture today. Because at Fort Chiswell, we transitioned to a very critical period of time of cultural preference in Southwest Virginia, and truly the country. Some of you may recognize the mansion on the right. This is an age of what is called neoclassical revival, or neoclassicism. It's a reawakened interest in the Greco-Roman world. Much of Europe renewed an interest in the classical world as early as the early 1700s, with the accidental discovery of Herculaneum and Pompeii. And with that came a greater revival in architectural design and symmetry that would merge into the Georgian world with more of a classical formulation of architectural and material goods. Key features: symmetry, ornamentation, rectangular plans. Most common was the double pile center hall passage. Today we call it the I house. Passage that would bisect the length of the house. Each side had a center passage, square room, both of an equal size. If you look at the McGavick Mansion here on the left, it is a towering figure that I dare you not to be able to see if you ever go down I-81 south or north. Absolutely, I see nods in the room. And that is why it was built there. It is a symbol of not only superiority for one's wealth, it's an emblem of status for an age that to attain material wealth means that you are able to do so and use it in proper ways to justify what you are able to accomplish in one's life. The mansion's brickwork is laid in Flemish bond on the north and front facades. Later additions, probably 1870s, but still blending of more Roman and Greek forms. It's especially evident when you look at the two-story diastole portico, which is composed of two more provincial Greek door columns that support a pediment without an architrave or a frieze, which is more typical of the order of columns. Its counterpart in Roanoke is Buena Vista, which was originally built in 1850 added on, I believe, in 1892, heralds pretty much the same features. Again, door columns, symmetry, balance on the right, 2 columns on the left. This is the extension that was added in 1892, added to the National Register in 1974. If you did get a better picture of it on the right, you would actually see that it would still have 1, 2, 1, 2 chimneys on the right and left side. Still very much in its formation. It's not Georgian, it's neoclassical, because you're now utilizing much more of a classical ordering in your life. But that speaks to pretty much everything else of what you want in life at this time. Meaning, you want refinement. A means of which to demonstrate your social emblems of status. Nothing speaks more than this clock. Probably the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life, honestly. And if you've never ever seen it, put it on your bucket list as well. It's located in the greatest city in the world, Williamsburg, Virginia. Sorry, I'm biased. At the Abbey Aldridge Folk Art Museum at Colonial Williamsburg. 2nd floor, and it's there, and they bought it for almost $250,000 in the 90s. It is one of the most intricate clocks I've ever seen in my entire life, and I'm about to tell you why. Emblems of status, and specifically the correct manners in which one uses those materials, served as social markers to one's wealth, knowledge, and connections not just to their locality, their region, their country, but to the world in general. And this one clock built by Peter Wythe and David Whipple is a great case study. This is a mahogany and mahogany veneer on cherry case clock. Likely a stage piece, meaning that it was probably put at the front of one's shop, show off one's ability to create such a extricate thing. Likely it was made for James Hogue Jr. Originally it was made originally for the Wythe family, but recent research actually proves that through estate records, we can actually prove that it was actually made for the Hogue family in Back Creek in Pulaski County, Virginia. The clock is an affluent man's piece of decorative art. Rare editions of both Arabic and Roman numerals on the clock face, 365 individual cuts of wood, 22,000 individual inlays of mahogany, cherry, tulip, poplar, oak, black walnut, holly, maple, bone, horn, silver, glass, iron, brass, and steel. It's a magnus opus that is representative of how early Southwest Virginia artisans are hybridizing urban neoclassical designs with local traditions and stubbornly saying, we're going to make things, but we're going to do it on our own terms. There is an ordering. Everything's symmetrical. There is a columning involved in the tall case clock. It is actually a pretty light clock, so I've been told. I've never been able to touch it, and I doubt I ever will be able to. There is another example made by Peter Wythe that is actually at the Taubman Museum in Roanoke as well. There's another more grandiose version that I don't know where it's being held to this day. And if you just even look at the size, and this is a black and white version of it, you see a lot of motifs that we've been talking about thus far. Star, columnating, even adding a lot more American nationalism for the very first time. The American Eagle here at the time. All intricately inlaid, piece by piece by piece by piece. But you got to add German features into it because this is a German folk. They earned from the tulip rising up. One that is rooted, sophisticated concern for visual order, classical illusions, and meticulous workmanship, and at times revealing a much more playful, less disciplined German influence spirit. And you can actually see there is a little feature here that is copied, and I apologize because it's just a little bit dark in the lighting here, that is actually carried over to gunsmithing with a trigger guard, originally picked by the Honeckers of Pulaski County and then into the workshop of one Jacob Schaefer into East Wythe County. This is one of his guns that you can see here. People like to copy each other, and people like to adapt and utilize what is popular. That's just one example of many. As rural urban centers developed into the 1830s and future on, taste and demand for luxury items pervaded all across the country, and especially into Southwest Virginia. After all, it was the thoroughfare for migration into the greater western continent. Cultural baggage still remained pretty strong. It was a strong influence affecting public gatherings and cultural expressions. One of my favorite cases involves actually a rare case of actually direct documentary evidence of one John Francis Hamtramck Claiborne from Natchez, Mississippi. He arrives to Wytheville, 1826, to learn under the law under Colonel Alexander Smith. Claiborne participated in what was called an apple frolic. He quotes, "Young people all assemble in a large room. There is an immense heap of apples to prepare for slices. A large brown mug, burnt toast, swimming on its surface, goes merrily around. Jokes and laughter closely pursue it. After 5 o'clock, after a hearty dinner of sauerkraut, pork, soup made of roasted flour and salt, noodle, bratwurst made of liver, lights of heart and hog, apple butter, Lautenvic, Schmidt-Heiss, mixed on a spread of large slices of white bread." Getting that fiber, right? "We arrange ourselves for the dance." Eating all that and then dancing afterwards. At length, the fiddler came with his odd 3-stringed instrument, and the call was loud for, quote, "Possum up the gum tree." I was excused from dancing as I stumped my toe and walking across the floor, but was unwilling to be a passive spectator. I seized upon a brass kettle and gave him what that I had never heard before, a little of the triangle, because that's all he could do at the point. Just bring a triangle, right? And this is to go then with a fiddle and dulcimer, made a very respectable orchestra. This is a very rare historic observation, not because it's just a very silly man who thought he was more privileged than the rest of the people in the room. But he makes a very poignant observation here of this thing in front of us, the dulcimer. Long, hollow, necklace wooden sound box with curved, straight sides, multiple wire strings, wire frets, laid out to play diatonic music scales. It comes to North America as early as the first part of the 18th century, particularly again through German immigrants from, actually through not Philadelphia but Baltimore. But from about 1820 to 1850s, this is now, we're reaching into the latter part of the antebellum period. As seen in Claiborne's account, non-German populations in America are actually starting to know what these types of instruments are, and actually becoming a lot more, at least, comfortable with them. This is called hybridization, at least from a cultural historian standpoint, in that they are occurring with dulcimers eventually that the non-German population and alteration of a much more raised fretboard, yet remain almost entirely Germanic in its origins. And yet still, this is one, and it's very rare to find one that is made before the Civil War. But this is one that I've seen, and so it's that high. If I was laying it on my lap, it actually has easels here, 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 and here underneath its entire body. It's about this long. And if you look closely at the frets here, those are hearts. That is a distressed, kind of like a veneer painting over that. And this is literally, if you reverse it on the side, is a sundial, almost. And if you were actually to turn it and play a board game, that's what it's supposed to look like. symbolizing the passage of time. The maker, and this is very, very rare because rarely do we actually get to see people that actually sign their name so we can attribute them. This person signs their name 5 times. Once here, JFF, another time on the bottom right here on the left, another time on the back part right there, another time at the back part on one of these frets, and then another one, I think, on the neck right here at the bottom. John Frederick Fink of Fort Chiswell, Wythe County, Virginia, 1866. Every single time either saying his entire name or JFF, comma, 1866. You can't make that up. Man's pretty freaking proud of what he did. But there are other things as well that we're a lot more recognizable with that are not necessarily just Germanic, but actually are, again, hybridizing of what is in demand for this period. I think we all know what we're looking at when we see these kind of pieces, the pie safes. Wythe County, of course, they're very famous for making these pie safes, especially from the Fleming Rich shop. It was actually originally the Thomas Moyers in Rich shop, as early as the early 1830s. Thomas S. Moyers, I should say, was a German, second-generation German immigrant to Wythe County, originally a wheelwright. He would come to downtown Wytheville, and when incorporating with his son-in-law, Fleming King Rich, begins a really massive operation that would not just build what we now know today as more famous as the pie safes, but would build carriages, they did repair jobs, they would send particle boards all across Southwest Virginia into Knox County, Tennessee. They had an operation that would expand into parts of New Orleans, into just before the Civil War period. And it became a lot more famous, especially when he brought upon his half-brother, Nimrod Rich, who was a tinsmith. And when we look at the 1820 census of manufacturers, this is the first time the United States is actually documenting manufacturers as an individual employment label. You can actually see he's doing a pretty poor job. He's out-competed, especially with people that are working in the town, and he's not necessarily making a pretty stable profit. He's actually working against one Montgomery County tinsmith by the name of Septimus Baxter, who did work pretty much everywhere. He did the work on the Montgomery jailhouse, the courthouse, Capitol building. He did work for the Dublin court and jailhouse. He was working everywhere. He was being out proportionate for somebody who had the connections at that time. So instead, what he would do is he would go work for his half-brother in Thomas Moyers for a cabinet making industry. They were so successful that you could literally ship punched tin and send it to anybody across the United States. In fact, we have documentation for David Moyers, Fleming King Rich's half-brother, other half-brother, in Knox County, Tennessee, asking for 64 punched tins pre-made and then send them to other safes, that he could just apply them. And actually, if you look at other buildings that have built-in cupboards, you can actually find extant examples of remnants of tin that are still cut off, that people, when they were derelict and they go obsolete, literally people just took a knife and just cut them out. It's really tragic, but you can see the evidence still there. This is not a Wythe County piece. This is from Tazewell. This is from Burke's Garden. But those are Wythe tins. It was carefully applied directly on, slapped on with veneer, polished up. We're now into the 1850s, much more symmetrical, put it into a nice little dining room. That's all you need. But the legacy is still there. The legacy is still there. You can do as much as you want, but there are some things that you can't necessarily change. And that really is my message, at least tonight. Because by looking at these craftsmen and looking at their materials, we are seeing this history of dynamic change and a regional outlook that is actually much more appreciative at face value of what we see before us, before judging them as these outlandish people that did not have connections, where in fact, they were very much in connection with the greater world on every level. You can even look at silversmiths in Smith County in Saltville and look at their ledgers. There are envelopes pasted onto the ledgers that would say the greatest Bristol clocksmiths all across the ledger. It's from the Nye family. These are things that we should all be appreciative of, especially when it comes time to these understandings of what it means to be Southern, to be a part of Appalachia, to be a part of things that tell us about how objects are distributed and also what role these people played in a greater society. In doing so, it permits a much more broader and inclusive history. It can be traced not only to reflect the composition of this people and period that we've talked about in this chronology, but also ones that were being shaped still by external forces because they were very much attuned and aware and knowledgeable of those forces. We see how complex cultural baggage complicates in the way that people assimilated over time. And I thank you very much.
It's late, but does anybody want to ask questions? Any questions? It's late.
I know it's late. I'm sorry if I was on a diagram.